They laughed when I walked in, my shoes worn, my hands trembling around the gift I'd wrapped in old newspaper. My son's new in-laws saw a poor, nervous mother, grateful just to be invited. But what they didn't know was that the chair I sat on belonged to me. And by the time dinner was done, the truth would be sitting right there beside them, silent and priceless. The first lie I ever told about money was to myself. I called it privacy, as if silence could guard a secret better than humility could. Later, I learned it was not privacy I was keeping, it was peace. I was born into a world where money was loud and decency was quiet, and I made it my life's work to reverse that order. People like to believe that wealth changes you. Doesn't. It reveals you. It stretches whatever you already are until the world can see it. And for a long time I lived stretched between two truths, the woman who built everything with her own hands, and the mother who wanted her son to believe that kindness was the only currency worth having. I grew up in a town too small to have secrets, where gossip traveled faster than the school bus and every window was both a mirror and a confession. My father ran a small machine shop behind our house, a square building that smelled of oil and purpose. When I was a child, I thought the world ran on the rhythm of his hammer. My mother was quieter. Her hands always smelled of soap and her prayers were the kind that asked for just enough, never more. I remember one winter when we couldn't afford heating oil, and my mother gathered every blanket we had and said, "We'll survive with warmth made from people, not pipes." She was right. That night, huddled together, I learned the first lesson of value. Not everything that keeps you alive can be bought. When I met my husband, Robert, he was a man with calloused hands and gentle eyes. He was not rich, but he was steady, and steadiness was a luxury where I came from. We married young, before dreams could be traded for logic. The wedding cost $50 and 2 favors, one from the church and one from my father's old friend who played the organ. I wore a borrowed dress and new hope. We built our life the way a carpenter builds a chair, slowly, deliberately, testing the weight of every joint. He worked at a shipping company, I handled accounts for a local store. We were not special, but we were sincere. That was enough. Until the cough came. It started small, the kind of sound that lives between words. Then it became the kind of silence that takes up space. Doctors were kind but vague, as if mercy required vagueness. Within a year, I was watching my husband fade in a room that smelled of antiseptic and soft defeat. On the last night he took my hand and said, "Don't let life harden you. Build something that remembers me kindly." Promised. I didn't know then that promises can be blueprints. After the funeral, the world continued, as if kindness had deadlines. Bills still came. Rent still whispered. I learned that survival has its own kind of grace, the grace of women not afford collapse. I worked until my hands forgot they were mine. I worked until exhaustion became the only language my body spoke fluently. When the small grocery I worked for went under, I borrowed an old truck from a friend and began hauling leftover inventory to open markets. It was supposed to be temporary, a patchwork of days stitched together with fatigue. But that's the thing about necessity. It teaches you to improvise, and improvisation is the first cousin of innovation. What began as survival grew into something sturdier. I learned about suppliers' routes, delivery schedules. I learned how to read people's greed in the lines around their mouths, and their truth in the tone they used to say next time. Slowly, painfully, I built my own business. I never wore designer clothes, never vacation where the rich go to feel poor for a week. My wealth was built in warehouses that smelled like wood and diesel, in offices that hummed with printers and coffee. My company handled logistics, storage, delivery, the quiet veins that feed the world without applause. People imagine fortune as fireworks. Mine was fog. It rolled in so slowly I barely noticed when I could finally breathe. My son, Evan, grew up between the whir of forklifts and the lullaby of engines. I'd set up a small corner of the office for him, a plastic table, crayons, a jar of candy. Sometimes I'd look up from an invoice and see him sleeping on the floor under my desk, surrounded by paper mountains of bills and orders. He once asked, "Mom, why do you always work so late?" I smiled. "Because tomorrow won't build itself." He laughed, rolled onto his side and whispered, "Then I'll help you when I'm big." He kept that promise in spirit even if life led him somewhere else. By the time he finished college, I had already hidden the fullness of my success. Not to deceive him, but to protect him. I didn't want him growing up defined by numbers. I wanted him to believe in people, not profit margins. so I downplayed things. My home was modest, my clothes simple, my meals humble. Money should never be seen before character. He found work in architecture, something I admired. He liked to build things that would outlast him. In that, he was my husband's son. Then came her, Amelia. Beautiful, polished, ambitious. The kind of woman whose perfume arrived before her smile. She carried herself like someone taught that ceilings were made to be replaced, not respected. But beneath her confidence I saw uncertainty, like she had rehearsed grace but not kindness. When he first brought her home for dinner, she looked at my little kitchen like it was a test she hadn't studied for. My son, eager, filled every silence. "Mom makes the best pot roast," he said, as if comfort food could bridge worlds. Amelia smiled, thin and polite. "It smells nostalgic." That word stayed with me. Nostalgic. It was the kind of word people use when they want to sound kind without sincerity. But I saw how much he loved her. Love makes fools of even the wise, and mothers are no exception. Months later I got the call. "Mom," he said, "they want to meet you properly. Amelia's parents are hosting a dinner. They want you to come." I could hear the hope in his voice, the quiet plea beneath his words. "Please make them like you. Please make them see that we belong." I smiled into the phone. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll be there." After we hung up, the silence of my house felt different. It wasn't loneliness, it was preparation. That week I sat at my desk surrounded by ledgers, deeds, contracts, the paper ghosts of my life's work. I could have walked into that dinner wearing a dress worth more than their chandelier. I could have arrived in a car that never parks on the street. But pride is not a costume, it's a compass. I wanted to see them. Not their money, not their manners. Them. So I decided to wear. The morning of the dinner, I ironed my old brown coat. The fabric had thinned, but it still carried the smell of years I refused to forget. I polished my shoes until they gleamed like promises and wrapped a gift in yesterday's newspaper. A book, the same family recipe journal I'd started after Robert's passing. On the last page I'd written one of his sayings: "If you can't be proud of where you came from, you'll never be truly rich." Before leaving, I stopped by the yard where my first truck still sat under a tarp. The paint had faded, the logo barely visible, but the sight of it steadied me. That truck had carried everything: inventory, hope, and grief. I touched its side and whispered, "Let's go see what we built." The drive to the city took 2 hours. Through the window, the landscape changed from modest porches to mansions fenced with fear of trespass. The closer I got, the more invisible I felt. When I arrived at their neighborhood, the air itself seemed trained to behave. The hedges were sculpted into obedience. Even the birds sounded expensive. Their house waited at the end of a cul-de-sac shaped like a question mark. I pressed the doorbell, and the chime echoed like glass being struck. The door opened. A woman in pearls looked me up and down. Her expression was a calculation disguised as a welcome. "You must be Evan's mother," she said. Her tone balanced perfectly between politeness and pity. "Yes," I said. "And you must be Amelia's." Her smile tightened. "Do come in." I stepped across the threshold. The marble beneath my shoes was colder than I expected. Inside, a chandelier dripped light like expensive rain. Laughter drifted from the dining room. Every voice in it sounded sure of its own importance. I stood for a moment, feeling the weight of their scrutiny before it even arrived. I looked down at my coat, at the paper-wrapped gift in my hand, and smiled to myself. They would see a poor, naive mother. Never see, until it was too late, was that I owned half the ground their house was standing on. I straightened my shoulders, breathed in the scent of their polished world, and stepped forward. Let them judge. By the end of the night, they would learn that wealth can't be worn, and humility can't be faked. They seated me where the light punished the honest. The chandelier threw its small suns onto the center of the table, where crystal could pretend it was important. At the edges, where the chairs were less photographed, the light thinned into something workable. They placed me there, between a sideboard that smelled faintly of beeswax and a painting of a racehorse that had never carried a burden it didn't choose. Someone had diagrammed the placements with the care of a minor coup. Amelia's father at the head, her mother to his right, a cousin with rehearsed opinions to his left, a grandmother who had learned contempt before grammar beside me, and my son opposite, as if distance could protect him from the arithmetic that was about to begin. Greetings had already been exchanged in that trembling register of politeness that chews the ends off words. Even the napkins looked alert. A butler, thin as precision, frictionless as the idea of money, poured water as if he were refilling an argument. The glasses were so clear they felt risky. I folded my old brown coat over the back of the chair and rested the newspaper-wrapped gift on my lap until someone asked for it, which is to say, until someone asked for permission to judge. A murmur rippled through the room, the private weather of people who believe their comfort is a public service. It started with the grandmother, a fluttering sigh like a curtain moving without wind, and drifted to the cousin, who smiled at me with the generosity of a border guard. They wanted to perform welcome without paying its cost. I have known this dance longer than I have owned anything. The first step is always observation, the second, measurement, the third, correction disguised as concern. They ask the questions people ask when they are building a staircase up which they hope you will climb, and then thank them for the altitude. Where do you live? Oh, over there. Do you drive in? What do you do? Logistics, you say, such an industrious field. The word industrious landed like a lint roller. Someone admired my restraint in jewelry. Someone else admired my apparent good health, the way a person admires a houseplant that has survived a winter despite the owners forgetting the sun. The mother, pearls and perfect citizenship around her throat, complimented the wrapping paper with a smile that tried to pass as whimsy and presented itself as audit. My son watched me the way you watch a candle you forgot on a bookshelf, worried and a little ashamed to be worried. He smiled too much, spoke too quickly, filled silences that didn't need him, and each time he finished a sentence, the father at the head of the table patted the air with his hand as if calming a faithful dog. Pride does that to even the kind men. It teaches them that gestures can keep a world in place. Never does. Introductions presented themselves as recipes, the ingredients of an important family, measured and listed, provenance assured. The father, Victor, ran investments that had learned to speak in seasons. A farm once long ago had made the first money, and it still haunted their speech with the sound of land pretending to remember them. The mother, Elena, chaired committees that curated charity into photographs. The cousin oversaw a gallery. The grandmother remembered old addresses the way other people remember hymns. There was also an uncle whose laugh tried to be contagious and spread only fatigue. And there, glimmering with effort, was Amelia, caught between the gravity of her childhood and the orbit she hoped to choose. Soup arrived in bowls that made steam look expensive. It tasted like the kitchen had worked very hard to erase all signs of effort. While we lifted spoons, the questions sharpened, became the kind a room asks when it wants to see whether your dignity will smudge. Had I traveled far? Did I find the neighborhood easily? Was the gate code confusing? It wasn't yet contempt, it was reconnaissance. Their faces weighted like clipboards. I gave them answers neither short nor defensive, because there is a power in answering the world the same way you would greet a stray dog. Open palm, steady voice, no fear of teeth. I said the bus had been steady, the walk generous, the gate dignified and a little timid about pedestrians. I said the neighborhood smelled like cut boxwood and the memory of rain. I said their house surprised me less than their faces, which had already shown me more than any chandelier could hide. I said it all with a smile that did not ask to be believed. My son exhaled in tiny installments like paying a debt on a machine that will not stop until it is sure you can afford it. The first small act of meanness arrived the way a summer fly arrives, confident that the room belongs to it. The grandmother turned her ear toward me, considered its own hearing, then rasped, "We were told you were practical." The pause shoved the word down a small flight of stairs. Practical is so in fashion this decade. Her smile had the flutter of a moth that has outlived the lamp. The cousin peered at my shoes and added, "Practical can be very chic." I think they wanted me to be grateful that they had thought of a compliment that would not embarrass their mirrors. Amelia's mother reached for the gift, the way a conductor reaches for silence. "Oh," she said, eyes warming to a performance temperature. "How charming." She said charming the way a surgeon says benign without promising survival. She peeled the newspaper with the delicacy of a person unwrapping a secret they hope will be small. The cookbook appeared, stitched with my handwriting, glossy with old spills, the edges a geography of use, and for a moment a genuine question crossed her face. It didn't stay. "A family recipe book," she announced to the table. turning toward an audience that had already decided the ending. So quaint. We love authenticity. She placed it beside the centerpiece like a trinket found in an attic someone keeps for its story but not its worth. I thought of my husband, of the page where his handwriting still lives between my notes, a recipe for stew that refuses to be rushed. I breathed and let the moment pass over me, the way you let a wave hit you when you have feet you trust. Not everything that strikes has authority. Some blows are just water. Wine marched in next, bottles that arrived with the politesse of ambassadors. Victor performed the telling of their origin as if decanting memory could turn it into proof. The labels were named like horses. The descriptions floated hints of fruit that had never visited my mouth. He raised a glass and toasted beginnings. The word held very still in the air. Beginnings in rooms like this are often code for endings someone else will pay for. I lifted my glass, not high, not low, and met the eyes that would be my family if kindness won. Small talk found its spine. A neighbor had done something unwise with a hedge. A gallery had sold a sculpture that made the buyer feel tender and rich at once. A committee had selected the theme for a fundraiser that would photograph well. Charity was discussed as an art form. Their voices did a dance I have seen in industries that make nothing and sell everything, the dance that keeps the room moving fast enough to avoid the sentence that might demand an answer. Then came the first question that tried to find my price. Your work, Victor said, making logistics sound like a necessary rumor. How hands-on is it? He wanted the spectacle of dirt under my nails. He wanted to watch a woman perform a story he once felt good for forgiving. Hands-on, I told him, like a pilot landing during a storm. Hands-on like a shepherd who knows the names of the wolves. Hands-on enough to know whom to call when a truck door jams in January, when a driver's mother dies on a Thursday, when a union leader signals with a cough that you've taken 2 inches more than the workers can give without losing a finger. There's a choreography under the commodities report that doesn't make it into newsletters, I said. We keep the world arranged without an audience. He smiled, but it didn't change his face. Ah, the real economy, he said, pleased to have a phrase. My father always said we need people who can move things. The we was a mezzanine he assumed I could not reach. Amelia tried to help. She asked about my first truck. She remembered, or had been told, that old stories fit this room like antiques. She touched the cookbook with her fingers and said the word heirloom as if offering a treaty. Between her sentence and the next, Elena slid a glance toward a woman near the door, someone I had read as a housekeeper because of the uniform the house demanded of her, and signaled the next course. I followed that woman with my eyes, the quiet map of her day. She moved with the discipline of someone whose mistakes are noticed before her achievements. When she set a plate before me, fish that smelled as if the ocean had attended finishing school, our hands nearly touched. There was the smallest scrape of her skin against the rim, a sound I know from decades of rooms that refused to forgive human contact with their objects. Elena's mouth tightened, and I watched the woman's shoulders learn a new apology without words. I held the plate steady and said thank you with the sort of warmth that does not ask permission to be humane. She looked at me once, and in that look lived 2 entire biographies, hers and the one I could have had if the numbers had come out differently in a year when everything risked breaking. Conversation drifted to the wedding. Dates, colors, a rehearsal dinner that sounded like it required rehearsal. Tell us, Victor said, the way a man orders a horse to show trot, how you'll participate. We were thinking, were we not, dear, of perhaps a small reading at the ceremony. Something homespun. Elena brightened. Yes, those touches play so well on video. The internet simply loves authenticity. The word internet looked out of place in her mouth like a rental. It took me a heartbeat to understand the sentence they were building. I saw it then, a role chosen with care to keep me quaint. A manageable mother, curated into a frame that would not require the photographer to remeter the light. Homespun like a garnish of the old life placed on the plate of the new. I set my fork down and smiled with gratitude that did not belong to them. I'd be honored, I said, because there is an honor in choosing how a story is told. I have a poem of my husband's that fits a day that requires people to promise what they mean. Elena applauded the idea of meaning. The room returned to its preferred speed. Coffee appeared before dessert, a choice that announced European ancestry like a flag. Cups clinked. The cousin began a sermon about art that looks broken but is expensive. I let the talk pass through me, A river I stood beside because walking into it would have been charity. Then the room's attention noticed me again and, a little bored with gentility, began to feed itself. It started with an oh-so-small spill. The grandmother's spoon dropped a dark splash of sauce onto the cloth near my elbow, a stain that shaped itself into an invitation. Elena gasped, performed worry, fluttered at the edge of my plate with her napkin but never touched the stain, then looked, puzzled and pretty, at the quiet woman in the doorway. The woman came, as women like her always come, swiftly, invisibly, with a cloth that has cleaned more accidents than children can imagine. She dabbed, retreated. "These things happen," Elena said to the table in general, and then to me warmly. "It must be such a relief for you not to worry about the laundry tonight." It was the kind of sentence you can't object to without losing the case. I nodded. "It always relieves me," I said, "to see work done well." The cousin laughed as if I had admitted an affection for rain. "People so often don't appreciate service," he said, looking at the woman who had cleaned the stain as if she were part of the fixture. "It's almost a lost art recruiting people who still care." His smile found me. "Our parents have standards. They were raised properly." Properly did what it always does. It asked everyone at the table to agree on who didn't belong. I have learned to choose my silences. This one I let lengthen. In silence the scaffolding shows. Behind their talk, behind their manners, the structure revealed itself, a family polished by the belief that arrangement is the same as goodness. The door from the kitchen swung on its hidden hinge and the smell of citrus arrived wearing sugar. Dessert came in on square white plates, architecture passing for pastry. Elena praised the chef by his first name, as if their intimacy would season our gratitude. Victor checked his watch, the gesture of a man whose money thinks in time zones. Then, as if remembering a ritual that would bring luck, Elena called for speeches. Not formal speeches, no, nothing so heavy. Just small words, as she put it, from each of us. It was a kindness dressed as tradition. It was also a narrowing that made room only for people who already lived at the center. They went in order of precedence, which is to say, in the order of who would be most missed by lawyers. Victor praised legacy. The cousin praised taste. The uncle praised luck as if he had invented it. The grandmother praised endurance and managed, in the space between phrases, to imply that her endurance was the only kind the century respected. My son stood and sweetly stumbled. He thanked them for making space for a boy from a quieter street. He thanked me for teaching him to name the colors of sky-old roofs adopt at dusk. He thanked Amelia for choosing him. He sat down with the small dignity of a person who does not yet know how much of himself he has offered to a room that asked for nothing. My turn came with a hush that had waited for me all evening. I stood slow and comfortable as a tree deciding to move. I did not lift my glass. I let my hands rest on the back of my chair where my old coat hung, the brown worn smooth at the shoulders, the fabric smelling faintly of autumn rain from some other year. The light gathered itself to hear me. "I brought a gift," I said, nodding toward the cookbook. "Not because gifts are required, but because stories need a table to live on." I told them about the last page, my husband's handwriting, the stew you cannot hurry. I told them about a winter when blankets were our heater, and how I learned that warmth is a craft. I told them that wealth wears many faces and the only version that endures is the one that has learned to carry other people without calling it generosity. I said that I was grateful my son had found someone whose future asked for his tenderness, not his resume. The room did not move. In my periphery, I saw the quiet woman from the kitchen pause in the doorway, her body holding the tray the way a soldier holds a flag. She listened the way exhausted people listen when words are finally about them. The grandmother's mouth flattened. The cousin's smile crisped and then failed. Elena wore interest like a well-fitted dress. Victor's eyes narrowed, not with anger, anger is honest, but with the discomfort of a man being asked to admire an architecture he did not design. I ended without ornament. "May this home," I said, "be better at love than it is at lighting." A breath moved through the room. You could call it a laugh if laughter had manners. The toast concluded. People clinked precisely. Amelia's hand found my son's under the table. How do I know? Because his shoulders eased the way shoulders ease when the body remembers that kindness sometimes arrives in smaller bones. After dessert, the room loosened into corners. Victor led the cousin to a bar cart where bottles stood at attention like soldiers who had never fought. Elena did a tour of the centerpieces with a woman who had arrived late and looked magnificent with the guilt of it. The grandmother tested chairs as if they were suspects. My son escaped toward the terrace, pulled by air. Amelia hovered near me, a tether stretched between two worlds. You were, she started, stopped, began again. I feel like you and I live in different temperatures. We do, I said. But people survive in both. The trick is learning each other's weather. She looked at the cookbook as if it might bite. They mean well. Meaning is a cheaper stone than people think, I said. It scratches easily. Elena interrupted with the softness of a cat stepping on a piano. Shall we see the garden? It is rather a point of pride. Pride had many points tonight. We went. The garden was cut into obedience. Hedges trimmed to Euclid. Roses that pretended thorns were vulgar. Paths that made you forget the ground existed before money. We walked past a long table set for after-dinner coffee. Staff moved like choreography. In the half-light near a trellis, I saw the driver who has ferried thousands of people who never learn his name. He looked at me with curiosity, a centimeter too honest for this yard. I nodded. He nodded back. Small recognitions keep a person intact in places built to unmake them. On the edge of the path, a stone with an inscription, a family motto, Latin, that translated into something about virtue and perseverance. The irony didn't belabor itself. The night had enough work. Back inside, the evening progressed toward its thesis. They had built to a reveal of their own, a surprise gift for the couple. Elena struck the chime. The room gathered. A violinist manifested from a hallway like a memory of culture. A ribbon-wrapped envelope appeared, placed with ceremony before my son and Amelia. A contribution, Victor announced, toward the improvement of beginnings. He liked the word improvement. It did so much and promised so little. My son opened the envelope with the caution of a man who has never been able to afford to ruin paper. Inside, a check as neat as a lawn. The amount was generous enough to be photographed, small enough to remain a lesson in dependence. Everyone applauded. Everyone looked at Elena to learn how enthusiastic to be. My son's voice had a hitch in it when he thanked them, gratitude complicated by the knowledge that some gifts arrive with measurements inscribed in invisible ink. And then it happened. The moment that tells the truth so fast even the chandeliers cannot blink. The quiet woman from the kitchen entered with a tray of coffee, and in a room that punished friction, she caught the heel of her shoe on the border of a rug cut too close to the leg of a chair. The tray lurched. Cups kissed saucers violently. Coffee tilted into gravity's mouth. It was not a disaster. It was a human being colliding with the design of a house that does not make space for fatigue. But the room leapt on it. Elena's breath became theater. Victor stiffened into something ancestral. The cousin smiled with a small suffering pleasure. There were 6 drops of coffee on a cloth that had survived better stains. The woman's eyes blew wide in that way people's eyes do when they believe a single mistake will be weighed against the sum of their uses. She apologized with the whole width of her body. I moved before the room could finish writing the script. I stepped to the table, lifted my napkin, and with the available grace of 1,000 small messes I have cleaned in places where no one saw my hands, I dabbed the cloth, not fussing, not scolding the physics of liquid. I said, to no one particular and everyone at once, it's coffee. It has forgiven worse. The sentence fell oddly in that air. Victor started to say something managerial. I did not look at him. I looked at the woman and smiled, the kind of smile you give people when you are not asking them to bond with your mercy. Her shoulders returned to the shape a back should be. She looked at me as if my face had become a window. Elena released a breath, rearranged it into condescension and said, she said it beautifully, she had practiced this all her life. It's quite all right. Accidents happen. We aren't precious. The we was the size of a ballroom. The word precious wore its usual lie. The grandmother tapped her spoon against a cup, the crystal made a small cry, and she announced, bright as paper, in our day one learned the art of carrying. Her throat made a sound like a drawer refusing to close. Hands were steadier. Expectations too. She smiled at me for agreement, the way a person offers a leash. I have lost too much not to recognize the key that locks a person into their place. I did not take it. In our day, I said, one also learned the art of seeing. Everyone heard the sentence but pretended otherwise. Selective deafness is an heirloom in rooms like this. The cousin's smile died, this time without ceremony. Victor rang the smallest changes of displeasure on his face, and poured himself another correctness from a bottle with pewter shoulders. The evening could have ended there. Just another rehearsal for a ceremony that would prefer to remain theory. But houses that are built on managed dignity attract weather. A rumor of thunder moved through the west windows. Only a rumor. We were safe. Still, it made the glass admit that the world outside existed without permission. Someone suggested a tour of the library. Shelves done in a wood that expected to be touched by silk gloves. First editions arranged by how well their titles looked when friends visited. A ladder that rolled because rolling ladders make rooms sound literate. Victor gestured toward a desk the color of ambition. Came from a chapel in Lyon, he said. He loved geography as pedigree. We had it restored. Perfect fit. He was right. It fit perfectly the life it now served. While he spoke, my hand drifted across the back of a chair, carved with vines. A memory tapped me on the shoulder. I knew that vine. Not personally, but as a product, the carving pattern, the varnish that looks like it prefers candlelight, the unobtrusive signature burned beneath the seat that only a person who had once rented warehouse space to a company specializing in European acquisitions would know. The chair had traveled once through a space I managed. For a second I saw it crated, saw the shipping label with a destination that had looked familiar even then. I do not believe in omens. I believe in maps. Some nights maps fold themselves to show you where you're standing. Amelia stood very close to me. Her perfume had softened with the hours, and underneath it was the honest smell of person, nerves, hope, a stubborn wish. I don't know what to do when they do this, she whispered. It was not confession. It was reconnaissance, the small, brave kind a heart does when it refuses to be trained to silence. I could have told her to learn to perform grace more efficiently. I could have told her to pick me, to pick us, to pick something beyond her mother's mirror. Instead I said, you are allowed to be two things at once until you choose. But choosing will come. In the corner of the library sat a piano pretending it had not been purchased for photographs. Elena grazed its keys with the indifference of a person who knows the value of being seen trying. Victor asked me casual as a test whether I played. I said no. It wasn't exactly true. My fingers remember hymns with poor endings. But I knew what he was asking. He was asking, do you belong to the kind of culture we recognize as ours? The answer was no, and also, I belong to a culture that keeps the world from biting itself. We returned to the dining room for an afterlight of liqueur. Chairs reclaimed their claim. The quiet woman from the kitchen reappeared one more time. Time has to be paid in installments in houses like this, and when she set a small glass near my hand, she whispered, quick as prayer, "My mother has your stew recipe." And then she was gone, swallowed by a corridor that did not learn names. A small joy lit my ribs. There are inheritances with no paperwork that travel faster than money. The night was almost finished, but the scene had not yet found its point. It came coated in mirth. The cousin told a story about a prank at a country club that ended with a groundskeeper wet and humiliated and a room of the right people delighted by the honesty of laughter. Everyone laughed again, faithfully. And then in the loyal lull after laughter, Elena turned to me with the expression of a woman who has been waiting to enjoy her line and said, not unkindly, not even loudly, indeed, she was careful with the pitch, the way a violinist is careful with a difficult note. "We are so very glad Evan has found his way up." The sentence was polished. It had been polished by generations. It was meant to be kind the way a trophy is meant to be generous when it allows fingerprints. Found his way up. Up from where? And who had built the stairs? No one else heard the sentence collapse under its own design. My son did. His breath snagged. A small muscle in his cheek knotted. He opened his mouth, but the room's weather rose to protect itself. Someone asked about the cake. Someone else admired a sconce. The night tried to end as if endings were a country they owned. I stood. Not loudly. Not grandly. I stood like someone for whom standing costs nothing because her work requires it. The room, trained for performances, went quiet with relief. Here, at last, was the maternal benediction, the homespun grace, the soft hand on the head of a child being accepted into a better house. "I should be going," I said, and in my voice was the kindness of a sidewalk after rain. Faces adjusted. Polite protests put on their coats. Victor extended his hand the way a man extends a bridge that charges toll. Elena lifted her face for the kiss that photographs practice. The grandmother measured the degree to which she would approve later. I put on my old brown coat. Its weight steadied me the way some people are steadied by belts of leather. At the door I turned, not for drama, for accuracy. "Thank you," I said. "For dinner." I looked at the quiet woman from the kitchen and said, louder than the house wanted, "And thank you for your work." She nodded, and in that nod lived a survival guide. I looked at Victor's hands, at Elena's pearls, at the cousin's immaculate boredom. "You have a beautiful home," I said. "And it has taught me what it values." I smiled until courtesy understood it had been honored and could leave. Outside, the gravel did its shy music. The night had cooled into honesty. The gate accepted me the way a well-trained dog accepts that strangers will come and go without asking permission. My son caught up to me in the dark between the gate and the street. He said my name as if he were 4 and couldn't reach a shelf. We stood in the public light, which is another way of saying the truthful kind. He apologized for their weather, because that is what good men do when they are born into a climate that stings. I put my hand on his cheek and felt the child that once studied invoices beneath my desk. "Up," I said, answering the sentence that would have otherwise followed him into sleep. "There is no up and down, only near and far. Tonight you were far. That can change." He asked me something with his eyes. He has always asked better with his eyes. I answered the way the only parent left must answer, with a promise that refuses melodrama. "I am not fragile," I said. "But I am not furniture. Watch how they treat the people who don't own keys." He breathed. A kind of decision moved through him, the early shape of it, not the final. He kissed my forehead, a gesture we learned the morning his father vanished into the kind of silence hospitals sell. "I'll walk you to the bus," he said, because rituals hold when architecture fails. We walked. The neighborhood pretended not to look at us. Somewhere behind us, through careful windows, laughter resumed. Laughter is a brave actor. It returns for second shows. At the stop, he tried to tell me that love would teach them. Love teaches. It doesn't always graduate. I told him I trusted him to hear his life. He asked, finally, because he is his mother's son, whether I needed anything. How could I tell him that need itself is a language I had retired? I asked him for only one thing. Bring their truest selves to your table before you bring yours to theirs. The bus came like an old friend, late, forgiving. I climbed the steps and sat where I always sit, in a seat that can see both exits. As we pulled away, I looked back once and saw Amelia in the gap between the hedges, her dress pale and undecided, her hand on the gate that makes pedestrians practice humility. She lifted that hand a fraction, a child's wave before the knowledge of audiences. She did not smile. I liked her better for it. On the ride home, the city changed back into the version I know. Streetlights making promises to puddles, men smoking fatigue beside their vans, a woman laughing into her phone with a laugh that had earned itself. I thought of the cookbook handed to a table that mistook it for nostalgia. I thought of the chair with vines I had once watched leave a warehouse I own in a truck I insure, bound for a house whose gate had an opinion about me. I thought of the quiet woman who had memorized my stew. And I thought of the road that curled toward their address, a road that had buckled last winter when the frost misremembered spring, a road my crews had risen from bed at 2 in the morning to salt and scrape and save. The invoice had been paid, slower than it should have been, but paid. The company that wrote the check belonged to a holding that belonged to another holding that belonged, ultimately, to a woman who had chosen a brown coat because sometimes truth travels best in camouflage. By the time I reached my neighborhood, a plan, not quite a plan, a patience, had settled into my bones. I wasn't thinking of revenge. Revenge is a young person's vocabulary for repair. I was thinking of tables. Which ones tell the truth? Which ones survive the weight of honesty? Which ones invite the right thunder? In my kitchen, with its chip tile and its calendar still showing a month that had forgotten to advance, I made tea the way I had made tea after 100 hard nights. The steam wrote its brief letter in the air. I opened the cookbook and turned to my husband's page. The ink had faded at the edges where grief had rested once. I laid my palm over his handwriting and let my body remember that I have already outlived worse weather than a chandelier's opinion. On the counter I set 3 envelopes. One to the company that catered the dinner, owned by a woman I have known since she watched her mother carry trays in the back of a hotel, whose lobby would not let her sit. One to the landscaping firm contracted for the wedding venue, whose payroll has nearly broken twice, both times rescued by checks I signed in the person of a subsidiary that prefers to be invisible. And one to a certain roadworks division, whose calendar could, if it wanted, take a day off for a wedding procession if a person whose name is never spoken asked nicely. I did not write threats. I wrote schedules. I wrote confirmations. I wrote the truth in calendar slots, which is where truth lives when it is ready to be useful. Then, because I am not a woman who confuses power with noise, I closed the envelopes and placed them beneath a paperweight shaped like a truck that once sat on my husband's desk. Sleep found me without persuasion. As I crossed into it, I saw the garden again, the inscription on the stone about virtue and perseverance, Latin pretending to be destiny. I imagined returning to that garden not with spectacles but with witnesses. Not to shame a family. To ask them a question in a language their house does not speak. How much is a person worth when no one is looking? When morning came, I wore the same coat to the warehouse and walked the line the way I used to before the numbers learned to hum without me. Drivers lifted their hands. The forklift sang its old baritone. A man with a new baby showed me a photo and a face that had slept 2 hours and still had room for joy. A woman I hired 10 years ago to clean invoices of their errors now runs a shift that moves more goods in 4 hours than a dozen committees can agree about in a week. I asked for reports. I signed payroll. I touched metal so it wouldn't forget me. And then I sat in my office and wrote a letter to my son. Not the kind that bleeds, the kind carpenters understand. Measure twice, cut once. I told him I loved him in the voice he trusts. I told him the stew recipe requires patience, or it turns bitter. I told him that sometimes you must let a table show you what it is before you place your heart on it. I told him I would be at the tasting for the wedding menu, not because I care about fish cooked to indifference but because I care about the woman who carries coffee through a room that wants to punish gravity. I sealed the letter and sent it not by email, which makes intimacy cheap, but by a driver whose hands I know, who once drove all night to get a pump to a farm before a thaw made mud into destiny. I asked him to deliver it to my son's office and to tell him, from me, that weather is not personal, it is practice. There is a way in which Act 2 of a life does not announce itself. It arrives in the utensils drawer, in the envelope placed under a paperweight, in the choice to say thank you to the person who cleans the stain. The reveal, should there be one, does not need trumpets. It only needs a table and a truth. We had both now. The table would be set again soon, for a tasting, for a rehearsal, for a ceremony that thought it would be the story. But the truth had already sat down, placed its napkin on its lap, and waited for the room to notice. And when they finally did, they would learn that humility is not a costume. It is an ownership record no chandelier can read, and no gate can keep out. Morning came in the voice that warehouses understand. Forklifts yawning to life, rolling doors rising like clean inhalations, radios murmuring the temperature in a tone that made weather sound negotiable. I walked the floor before the clock confessed 8, tapping pallets with the back of my fingers, greeting men and women with the kind of respect that is not theatrical because the body can smell theater. A driver with salt at his temples handed me a crumpled receipt and a newborn photo. I handed him an extra hour on next week's rota. We stood there for a second inside an economy that makes more sense than the one on television. 2 people trading time and tenderness, both more expensive than anyone will admit in public. By 9, the first ripple from last night reached me, an email from the wedding venue wrapped in euphemism. Minor adjustments to the landscaping schedule in advance of the tasting. I read between the hedges. The adjustments were not minor. A crew I knew by first names would be unexpectedly unavailable, for 2 days that mattered. Unavailable is the word rich people use when they do not want to explain that someone else has chosen a different weather for them. I walked to the window, watched a truck back into Bay 3 with the grace of a whale easing into a small harbor, and made 2 phone calls. The first to a foreman whose hands I had shaken in a sideways rain 10 winters ago. We never discussed money on the phone. We discussed weather and calendars, and those 2 nouns understood each other when they sat in the chair between us. The second to a woman who keeps a dozen crews breathing at once and still remembers birthdays. She laughed once, that tight corner laugh survivors use when a problem is merely plumbing. "I'll move stones, not mountains," she said. "It'll look like it always meant to be this way." I said thank you, which is how you stamp a contract in my country. The tasting was set for Thursday afternoon. In the days between, the city behaved like a person choosing which room to enter next. The in-laws' neighborhood practice being a myth, mine practice being a promise. I moved through both. If I had habit, it was to carry quiet with me like an instrument no one hears until the music laid down by other people grows thin. Evan called on Tuesday. The apology was still on his tongue, souring his coffee. They're excited, he said, and then softer. They're scared. He never uses the word scared about his future. He uses it about other people's parents when their money begins to shake. What do they fear? I asked, wiping dust from a windowsill in an office too busy to know dust by first name. That you won't fit. He hated the word as he said it. That you don't know their ways. Their ways aren't complicated, I said. They only require practice and forgetting. I am good at one and terrible at the other. He was quiet, and in his quiet I heard a saw choosing which board to trust. You were kind last night. You weren't. We let that sit between us like a bench. I'll do better, he said. Do truer, I said. Better leaves too quickly when the room changes. Wednesday afternoon, a messenger in a jacket too thin for a real winter handed me a cream envelope with handwriting that charged rent. Inside, an informal tea invitation at the gallery cousin's place for Amelia's circle, bridesmaids, godmothers, a few key friends. It sounded like a sieve disguised as a party. I turned the card over. The watermark wore a surname like a ring. I set it on the counter beside a handful of bolts I'd been meaning to return to the bien since before the century learned smartphones. The tea found me anyway. Rooms like there's travel even when you don't. Elena had brilliant timing. She called as I was walking the line, the background noise of shrink wrap singing over cardboard. We so hope you'll join us, she said, voice all velvet and landing strip. It's really just women. Just had never worked so hard. I said I'd try, which is the sentence you offer when a door is open but the room behind it has not earned you. At the gallery, White did what White does, pretended it invented purity. The cousin floated in linen, the color of milk money. Photographs of damaged objects hung carefully, the aesthetic of ruin purchased by people whose lives never require repair. We love textures, she said, guiding me toward a table where scones took up more space than hunger. Amelia was there, pale blue dress that forgave nothing, hair arranged the way a kindness might be taught to stand still. The friends, sincere, thin, trained to show loyalty in the language of posture, glowed with the nervousness of satellites. An older woman in a dress that would make a good curtain had a laugh like a round of silverware dropped into a drawer. Elena kissed both my cheeks and announced me to the table as the bridegroom's mother, so salt of the earth. The hyphens did more work than the phrase. Someone said we adore real people, and swallowed a grape. I took a seat at the edge where exits look like options. A server in black placed tea no one would drink with a hand that had learned to make itself smaller than objects. The talk was wedding talk until a friend with bangles like wind chimes asked, bright as a knife, what will you wear? A choir of expectation leaned forward. I touched my coat sleeve. Something that knows my history. Oh, she said, smiling the way you smile at a child who brought a pine cone to show in a vintage survivor, I said. Elena, helpful as gravity, interjected with a brochure, cloth samples for the mother of the groom packages at a boutique that rents its mirrors by the hour. We could go together, she said. It's such fun. They know how to. She fluttered her fingers, the universal sign for change without admitting you disapprove. Elevate. I thought of the road that would carry their guests to the venue, the small dip where spring snowmelt sits with bad intentions. The way a crew I loved had already moved a schedule so the dip would not be a surprise. I'll be elevated enough, I said. A little gravity keeps the photos honest. The older woman with the silverware laugh leaned in, breath of gin and the ashes of some old cruelty. Do you have people? She asked. You know, stylists, trainers, someone who manages the everything. I have foremen, I said. Dispatchers. Union stewards who call me at 3 in the morning when a driver's mother dies. A woman named Carol who has saved 2 payrolls with nothing but a Tuesday and nerve. She blinked in the rhythm of a curtain learning about wind. Amelia's eyes found mine, and for a second they were not her mother's daughter's eyes. Mom, she said, careful as a person crossing ice, maybe we could do something simple. Outside. barefoot even. The table tightened, a muscle anticipating a pain. Elena smiled the way a store smiles at a child with dirty coins. We'll do simple beautifully. Simple does not like being managed. It bites. At the tasting, the wedding planner, an efficient woman whose clipboards assembled us around a table that made the phrase farm to table feel like an apology. Victor arrived with the decisive air of a man who thinks menus are an allegory for leadership. Elena arrived with a clutch purse that held, I am certain, a version of the world where nothing uninvited happens. The chef introduced himself as Marco but really Mark, and made a joke about the poetry of salt. Staff lined the wall like grammar. Dishes marched in. Everyone made their faces do intelligent things. People ask the questions they ask when they want to be seen as curious rather than demanding. What is the forage percentage? Is the reduction reduced enough? Is the fish assertive? I watched the quiet choreography behind it, the exchange of plates, the whispered corrections, the body that stuttered near the oven because a burn does not care about tasting notes. The planner whispered, we adore a champagne tower. And my son, trying to love what he had not chosen, said he adored whatever made her happy. He meant Amelia. The table heard Elena. Then whether the real kind sent an email of its own. A boom rolled from a distance that sounded like a door closing on an old house. The lights hummed, considered their faith, and then returned. Marco laughed a little too big. We promise a generator. The planner added. We also promise candles, but only in thrifted brass, because authenticity photographs like a prayer. It was going somehow fine. The bread was the kind that knows your hands. The greens tasted like a field had been bullied into manners. The room was doing what rooms do at this altitude, pretending that intention can prevent gravity. And then the side door opened a fraction to let in an emergency it had not ordered. A young man with flour on his sleeve leaned in and did what people who weren't invited do. He looked for a permission he had never been given. He found my face and mistook me for the kind of woman who can authorize mercy. He whispered, Miss, sorry ma'am, can you just a second? The planner bristled like expensive hedges. Elena arranged her mouth into protection. I excused myself into the corridor where ovens speak plain. In the kitchen, the air was a climate that had not heard of pearls. A dishwasher had cut his hand on a glass that had broken itself and then blamed the nearest human. Blood, honest and unsentimental, brightened the steel. He was a boy, no, a man who had been paid like a boy too long, trying to keep quiet about his pain because pain interrupts the rich. I took the towel from a cook who was reaching for it with the desperation of a schedule, and pressed it where pressing means stop. Have you had a tetanus shot this decade? I asked. His eyes answered with a story about countries where such questions are luxury. Sit, I said, which is unfair to a man on a shift. He sat anyway, as if my voice carried the kind of gravity his life recognized. The kitchen manager arrived, efficient with worry. We're short, he said to nobody in the budget. We can't lose him tonight. You will, I said, exactly as kindly as truth allows. Or you will lose him longer later. He looked at me the way people look when their math forgets to include men. I pulled a phone from my coat pocket, called a clinic whose night desk still owed me a favor from a winter when I had paid for stitches for a driver who had mistaken steel edges for forgiveness. Send him, I said. I'll cover the bill. The manager's mouth arranged a thanks it could not afford. The boy man's eyes watered, not gratitude, biology. When I returned, the planner started to say rules. I handed her a card without a logo. The tasting will not notice, I said. The photos will survive. Elena tried to determine whether to be impressed or alarmed. She decided on both and it made her cheeks interesting. Back at the table, Victor wanted to know where I had gone in the tone of a man who has trusted a blueprint and found a window. To the kitchen, I said. The real one. He delivered a joke about mothers living in kitchens. It landed with a clink only he enjoyed. Amelia didn't look at him. She studied me as if I had made a choice no one had taught her was legal. She placed her hand on my son's hand under the table, because there are times when people who love you drive a stake into the ground quietly, to remind you a home can be built here. The planner, trying to rescue her schedule, moved us briskly to cake. We're very excited about the layers, she said. Layered things are so now. She sliced a wedge from a confection engineered to survive sudden applause. We tasted the architecture. Tasted like business casual. I want something that remembers mouths, I said before I could remind myself whose room I was in. The planner blinked as if I had spoken in a language older than seating charts. Bread, I said. A real cake is bread that remembers sugar long after the photograph is paid. Marco nodded as if his ghost father, the one who once worked in a bakery the city demolished to become a kind of glass, had just kissed him. We could do olive oil, he said. We could do citrus that doesn't apologize. We could do a crumb that forgives knives. Elena observed the table for a sign. There wasn't one she recognized, so she created one. As long as it's elegant, she said. We can't have rustic. Rustic is the insult money uses for anything that refuses to hide its muscles. The tasting ended the way storms end in novels, too neatly. The planner distributed copies of choices to be reconsidered later in emails at midnight. People hugged as if evidence. Victor shook hands with the chef and did that intimate thing men with portfolios do with other men. They pretend they share a secret no one else would enjoy. We dispersed into a parking lot that had memorized expensive tires. I felt eyes on me, kitchen eyes from a back door, a watching that wished me well without permission. I lifted a hand. I did not turn around. We owe some people the dignity of not making them perform gratitude. Two things happened the next day, which is how conflict always chooses its schedule, simultaneously and without apology. First, a small article drifted across the city like pollen. A local paper with a good memory for blue-collar miracles ran a story about night crews who had kept a stretch of road passable through a freeze-thaw tantrum. Names were small, but the photographs were honest. Men and women with faces summer will always remember, standing beside machines that do not care who loves them. In the photo's background, if you knew where to squint, the wedding venue's stone fence appeared. The story mentioned a subcontracted fund, plain named local, that had authorized extra shifts to protect businesses along the corridor. It did not mention me. It mentioned work done right. That's almost always enough to make the wrong people nervous. Second, Evan showed up at the warehouse. He arrived looking like a man who has misread a map with conviction. My crew, bless their politics, treated him like anyone. The nod, the good morning, the hand on the door that says you can go through alone. He found me in my office with my feet on a milk crate because some comforts refused to learn better posture. He stood in the doorway the way he used to stand there at 13, needing a new binder but asking whether there was enough month left for it. They're asking questions, he said, the word they standing in for a family and a gravity and a house with a chandelier that breaks meanings into glitter. About last night. About the kitchen. About the road. The road existed before the venue, I said. So did the kitchen. He laughed without laughter. Mom. I know. He looked at my hands, which were clean, and imagined them dirty. He cried a little and made a shape with his body so returning to not crying would be possible. I didn't defend you like I should have. He had practiced the sentence. It still shook when it landed. You don't defend me, I said. You remain yourself near me. That's enough. It doesn't feel like enough. It will when the room remembers what it forgot. He sat on the extra chair, the one that hurts unless you respect it. They think you were performing. He could barely say it. Poor. I wasn't performing, I said. I was choosing which truth to show. There's a difference. One begs. The other tests the room. He winced. He loves a room gentle. I used to. Then I learned what gentle cost other people. A knock. Carol entered with a stack of invoices and the look on her face that means the numbers have decided to drink, and she will be driving them home. She glanced at my son who had played on the carpet outside her desk while his shoelaces learned their first negotiation, and softened. We're good, she said. I just need a signature and a witness that at 10 this morning, you loved this company enough to make it angry. Done, I said and signed. Evan watched the pen travel the line, the ritual of authority mimeographed 1,000 times. He had the expression of a man mapping land he grew up on as if seeing it with new satellites. Come, I said when Carol left. We walked. He greeted people in the language I taught him. Eyes, names, the kind of handshake that tells a person you do not count their fingers afterward to make sure none are missing. A driver told him a joke that had survived 3 owners. He laughed because he owns the muscle. A woman with her hair tied like resolve asked him about Amelia. He blushed. The room allowed it. In the far bay, a pallet had shifted. We reshrunk it together, Plastic whispering around cardboard like a promise you can see. Near the loading dock, an old union man, shirt the color of stamps, smile the color of forgiveness, stopped us. He is the sort who reads sunrises and men. He looked at me, looked at Evan, looked at the distance between two families and said, "You ain't gotta fix 'em, boss. You just gotta let 'em hear themselves next to you." "Trying," I said. "Trying's a wage," he said, and went back to translating broken pallets into continuity. At dusk, Amelia called. Her voice had the frayed edge of a ribbon someone kept tying tighter. "Can we meet?" she asked. "Not at the house. Somewhere with chairs that don't try to impress the floor." We met at a diner where the coffee tastes like it has worked before, and the pies do the kind of honesty that makes you forgive sugar its gossip. She arrived wrapped in a coat that wanted to remember a different weather. Her hair was in a ponytail that did not photograph well and therefore deserved a parade. She slid into the booth and looked as if the chair might carry a verdict. I ordered tea because rituals carry me longer than vehicles. She ordered nothing and then, after a second, everything. "They think you embarrassed them," she said. "I did," I said. "They embarrassed themselves. This is what mirrors do." "My mother says you planned it," she whispered, glancing around as if the salt shaker would report to Elena. "The spill. The everything. I can't plan gravity," I said. "I can only honor it." She put her face in her hands for one private second and then lifted it again, the way divers lift their heads expecting waves and finding sky. "I don't know how to be two people at once." "You aren't," I said. "You're one person asked to speak two languages. One of those languages lies more than the other. Choose accordingly." "He loves you," she said, and made a small apology with her mouth for changing the subject to where it always belonged. "He also loves them." "Loving two houses," I said, "doesn't require moving out of one's self." She nodded the way people nod when they agree with truths that will ask them to do something later. "If I ask you a question, will you tell me the truth even if it hurts me?" "Yes," I said. "Otherwise the answer isn't mine." "Are you rich?" She pushed the word across the table like it might bite. "I am resourced," I said, "and responsible for those resources. Money is a tool. I own a shed." She laughed against her mouth like a woman trying not to wake a child. Then serious again. "If they find out." "They will," I said. "People always find out the wrong version first." "What happens then?" "The room will rearrange. We'll see who trips." The waitress, hair like a hymn, pen like a wand, set down pie that looked like courage had borrowed butter. "You two need anything else?" she asked. "Do you have time off?" I asked because I know what life does to women who keep other people's plates moving. She laughed and said Sunday and then added, honest as a hand, "Except when we don't." I left cash beneath the cup like the old country taught me. Amelia watched the ritual as if it were a sacrament from a church she hadn't known she missed. We stepped into night the color of a working river. Under the streetlight, her face decided to be older than the portrait in her mother's hallway. "I will try," she said, "to choose the language that lies less." "You will," I said. "And when you don't, you'll try again. That's called a life." At home, the envelopes on my counter had grown heavier like letters do when they've had time to practice being chosen. I sealed them and slid them into the slot at the corner post office where an old bulletin board still held lost dogs and found keys and a flyer for a yard sale that happened last summer, but still feels available. On the way back, the sky practiced rain without committing. The city imitated restraint. The next morning brought a phone call from Elena at an hour that assumes other people don't touch Dawn for work. Her voice had borrowed its confidence from glass. "We should discuss boundaries," she said. "The kitchen. The staff. The optics." "Optics," I repeated politely as if it were a new spice. "Yes," she said, emboldened by my misdirection. "Your involvement can be confusing." "For the," I said gently. "Or for the chandelier?" She did not appreciate the difference. "There is an order to events." "There is," I said. "And some of it exists outside your house." Silence, cordial, punished. "We want what's best for them," she said finally, meaning the couple. "We don't want distractions." "Then love them," I said. "And stop practicing for the camera." She exhaled the way a window fox. "You're very direct." "I'm very tired," I said. "It saves time. We end it politely." You can quilt a war out of polite endings. By Friday, minor tremors started in their house. A florist that had misunderstood the billing schedule, a pianist who had a conflict, a rental firm that had overbooked just enough chairs to force a conversation with a person who signs checks. These were not sabotages. These were proofs of a fact Elena had never required. The world is built by people who never appear in photographs, and if you are careless with them, the photograph blurs. Victor called Evan into his office and used words like stability and optics and narrative. My son, God keep him steady, used words like kindness and labor and the price of a human mistake. Voices did not raise. Disappointment raised the room. When he left, he stood in front of a painting of a sailboat in a storm that had not been painted by anyone who had ever drowned and decided to outlive it. He stood there and tried to hear his own weather over the sound of inherited thunder. That night Amelia texted me a photo, the cookbook open on her lap, a smear of something on the page like a blessing that missed its mark. We cooked the stew, she wrote. He cried at the onions. Felt like someone came home. I wrote back he did. I did not say which man I meant. Saturday dawned with a rehearsal at the venue, a pageant of logistics pretending to be romance. The road glistened obediently after an early morning crew had convinced it to forget frost. The hedges behaved. The planner arranged humans as if commas. The violinist tuned in a corner, unhappy to play sunlight. I arrived on foot because some steps are prayers. Staff, eyes like witnesses, saw me and saw what I am in rooms that don't require chandeliers. A woman who has never made them small to make herself taller. Elena lifted her chin and received me as if I were a letter from a country she conquered last week. Victor shook my hand as if it were daylight savings. The grandmother wore a brooch that used to mean something when ships had names. The cousin drifted with a glass like boredom had hired her. My son came toward me, and for once in front of them, kissed my cheek with the tender ferocity of a person who has stopped apologizing for loving what taught him to breathe. The rehearsal began. People walked where they were told. Children practiced not being children. A ring bearer rehearsed excellence and discovered pockets. Amelia, in a simple dress that refused to be an audition, moved down the aisle on her own 2 feet. The room forgot to breathe. For that moment, every committee died. I watched Victor watch her and think credit. I watched Elena watch her and think legacy. I watched my son watch her and think home. At the back of the hall, near the catering prep where Steam writes brief letters, the quiet woman from the dinner stood with a tray that would be needed later. Our eyes met, an event that would never be memorialized and therefore mattered. She nodded. I nodded. Somewhere in the building, a generator practiced faith. After, the planner released us like doves trained to return. People clustered into the conversations that ensure against thought. I stepped outside onto the road that had learned a new behavior, and breathed the kind of air that understands tires and feet. A truck rolled past, unmarked, wearing the livery of discretion. The driver raised 2 fingers in the old salute. I raised mine back. The gesture is older than weddings. Ms. A voice behind me, the plant with a clipboard bruised from love. Could I? She glanced toward the door, lowered her voice. My brother. He just got on at Crescent Asphalt. You know people there. I do not hoard introductions. They belong to the road. I asked a name. I told her who to call. I promised nothing but attention. She blinked gratitude like a Morse code only those raised by hard days read. I went home by bus, as I like to do when I need a city to translate me back into a person. Across the aisle, a couple fought in whispers about a heater that never warms the end of the apartment. In front, a woman drew a map to a new school for a child who would one day draw maps of her own. The bus sighed at lights like a tired god. I got off 2 stops early and walked the last blocks to let my coat remember my shape. On my porch sat a small box. No return address. Handwriting human in a neighborhood that prefers fonts. Inside, a note on stationery that had never seen sweat. For the day it read. Beneath, a delicate shawl in a color that imagines rainy lavender. Elena's peace offering. Or perhaps an attempt to dress my weather. I held it to my cheek. It smelled like a store. I folded it back into its paper and placed it on the shelf where old charity flyers and better intentions go to sleep. I wrote a thank you note because gratitude is not a language I will allow anyone to take from me. Night returned with hands full of small storms, emails about seating charts, A text from Evan with a photo of his shoes and the question these. A calendar reminder that Monday means payroll. Whether or not love has learned its steps. I stacked the week into piles the way an old librarian stacks thoughts and placed one more thing on the counter. A photograph of Robert in his work shirt, sleeves rolled, laughter in the corner of his mouth where seriousness could never quite evict it. I told him what the week had done. I told him I was tired. I told him his stew made a grown man cry. I told him we were almost to the part of the story where truth stops being a guest and asks for a key. Before sleep, I stood at the window and watched the street practice being empty. Somewhere across town, in a house that rents its light, two people were learning about a word that does not behave enough. It is the hardest word. Not because it is difficult to say, but because it requires people to let go of mirrors. In the dark, my phone whispered. A message from a number that once belonged to a gala committee now belonged to a human. You don't know me. I clear linens. Last night, you said thank you loud enough for my mother to hear it when I told her. Thank you. I set the phone on the sill and let gratitude have the room for once. It arranged the chairs better than any planner. Rising conflict is a bridge made from the ordinary's deepest bones. Nothing has exploded yet, and already everyone is choosing. The road is ready. The staff is watching. The love is awake. The chandelier has heard a rumor about gravity it does not like. And somewhere in a drawer that holds receipts and mercy, a deed waits with my name written in ink that does not apologize. Next, the room will try to rearrange the truth. And the truth, tired of being polite, will simply stay where it is. Rooms that perform goodness begin to shake when kindness stops rehearsing and starts working. It was subtle at first. The way the in-laws' house exhaled too quickly when the door opened, the way the chandelier flickered as if someone had explained gravity to it. But then the escalations arrived with their usual disguises, calendars, favors, features, a charity that wanted photographs more than mercy. Everywhere, the story asked a private question and insisted on a public answer. Elena began with the oldest tool she knew, a page that makes a person permanent. A magazine she curated by proximity, a publication that travels on coffee tables like a polite rumor, wanted to do a feature on the modern wedding that honors legacy. She called it a gift. Victor called it an opportunity. The planner called it earned narrative. The photographer called it a light-forward story. And my son, whose hands have only ever wanted to build weight-bearing things, called me and said he could feel the air thinning. The shoot was scheduled for a Saturday that smelled like good rain before it commits. In their house, an editor with eyes like polished stones arranged objects into versions of themselves you can sell. She moved a bowl of lemons closer to a window, which is where lemons learn to perform honesty, and asked for a touch more lived in. Staff were sent to fetch items that had earned their patina somewhere else. A borrowed throw, a borrowed stack of indie cookbooks that had never met an onion, a borrowed plant with a leaf that had learned camera angles. Perfection required sincerity, sincerity required props. They posed the couple on the staircase that has always wanted to be a thesis. Amelia's smile had not slept. My son's jaw worked like a hard-won hinge. The editor asked them to laugh, which is the cruelest direction you can give people who are out of breath. Elena stood nearby. The shawl she had sent me folded over her arm like a question. The grandmother hovered just far enough away to be blameless, just close enough to claim credit. The cousin practiced absorption. Let's get a moment with the mothers, the photographer said, cheerful as a knife wrapped in linen. They placed Elena and me on a settee that hates bodies. She draped the lavender shawl over my shoulders to prove that generosity fits. I let it sit for a second, then lifted it off and folded it beside me as carefully as a wound. The camera shutter learned a new rhythm. The editor asked for hands, which is what people ask for when they want proof of tenderness. Elena laced her fingers together as if prayer were a performance, and I rested mine in my lap like tools that have earned a clean afternoon. Afterward, the editor pulled Amelia aside for a solo shot by the window where the light forgives even expensive decisions. She told her to look into the middle distance and imagine the future. The middle distance blinked. Amelia looked where the cookbook had been placed like a token on a side table. She looked out toward the road and the rumor of weather that lives beyond gates. She looked at me very quickly, not asking for permission anymore. The feature would be beautiful. It would say all the right things aloud and none of the truer things underneath. It would praise legacy, curate humility, hail the cake as a modern ode to tradition. It would photograph the chandelier and forget the generator. It would name designers and omit dispatchers. It would carry the scent of lemons and erase the hands that carried those lemons from a truck to a sink to a bowl to a page. Escalation rarely calls itself by its name, calls itself celebration. The second tremor arrived at a fundraiser where money wears its best behavior. The family chaired an event for literacy, which meant gowns, ice that remembers shapes, and speeches that believe they can lift a book by raising a glass. The venue was low light on purpose. The flowers competed with their own scent. The program was printed on paper heavy enough to earn a shelf. The orchestra studied excellence until it sounded like wealth. I attended because the invitation said family, and I try not to train words to lie. I wore the brown coat because it knows the way out of rooms that confuse politeness with affection. In the foyer, I watched donors greet one another with the thrill of people who have memorized the same passwords. I listened to conversations that use dollar amounts as grammar. I smiled at a man whose cufflinks could vouch for a small nation's credit line, and then turned to thank the woman who handed me water with a grip that had sewn her children's jackets at night for years before this city earned them. On the stage, a host with a voice that can hurt cats told a story about a classroom that had been saved by a check. People sighed in the key of tax deduction. Near the back, a librarian who had survived 6 principals dabbed her eyes with a napkin that had been ironed. Elena, radiant with a napkin that had been ironed. Elena, radiant and correct, spoke of community, the way a sommelier speaks of vineyards with good weather. Victor followed with a graceful appeal to generosity that had practiced its compliments. A boy from a public school recited a poem that had memorized him first. During the break, the cousin led a tour through an installation, books suspended from the ceiling as if librarians had suddenly discovered levitation. Everyone loved the metaphor until the fire marshal frowned. "We adore the optics," the cousin whispered to me, unaware of how sentences look when they are dressed in truth. I nodded and wondered how many of those books would survive without people who are paid badly to care about them. Opposite the bar, a small display, photographs of benefactors holding paperbacks like newborns. I recognized names arranged like a psalm of capital. Near the bottom, a photo of a warehouse library, a grim, beautiful thing, used by a nonprofit that ships used books to prisons. The caption thanked anonymous donors. The photograph had been taken in a space I lease for less than the market rate to a program that never learned how to afford a lawyer. I stood still and let the image pass through me. My name wasn't the point. The books were the point. The men who would hold them were the point. The silence that would hold those men if the books did not arrive was the point. Back at their table, Victor toasted Elena's leadership with a practiced tenderness that could not decide whether to be husband or brand ambassador. The grandmother told a story about a governess who had taught her Latin and the exact angle at which to decline a man. The man beside me, who builds condos with kitchens that only know what plates look like, asked what I do, in a voice that couldn't imagine a reply. "I move things," I said. He nodded as if I had confessed to a hobby, and went in search of someone who had an interest in interior sanctuaries. When it was over, the room deflated gracefully, like a dress too tight for air. Outside, a drizzle practiced restraint. Outside, a drizzle practiced restraint. I walked to the bus stop with my coat unbuttoned because some nights we let the weather do as it pleases. A woman from the catering staff hurried by, balancing a box with the care of a midwife. She recognized me from somewhere it mattered. "We donate the extra," she said, without prompting, without pride. "There's a church on 9th that feeds whoever asks." I wanted to hug her and settled for the more dangerous thing. I believed in her. The gala raised money. It also raised the waterline in a house that has never learned to swim. The next day, Elena announced that the wedding would be scaled for intimacy, a word that loves to be misinterpreted. Fewer plus ones. A new seating plan that placed my son's friends, the ones with second-hand suits and dependable hearts, near the kitchen door. The florist would go simpler, which meant less of what grows and more of what shines. The orchestra would be smaller, their playlist reduced to the songs that prove you know old money even when you don't. Amelia called, not to ask my opinion, to hear herself decide. "We could do it in a field," she said suddenly, the way a child says the word dragon to learn what fear tastes like. "Boots bread, a long table, sky." "You could," I said. "And if you don't, you can still eat like you meant to." She laughed and then, reminding herself which room she was still standing in, measured her breath. Conflict escalates in quiet households by changing the instructions on the small things. Invitations were reprinted with inks that judge. Upstairs, the house panicked politely. Elena fretted for optics. Victor fretted for control. The grandmother pronounced the 19th century exhausted. The cousin dug for battery-powered fairy lights and found a mirror. Amelia moved like someone who has given up on ladders and wants to try ground. My son came to the kitchen because his feet have always known where people work. He found me there. I was already naming things by what they were, which is what you do when electricity forgets pretension. We formed a line with staff. Candles, plates, matches, breath. We sent light out into a house that confused brightness with safety. We marked the floor with tape so servers could find their lives without inventing accidents. We laughed because laughter returns when competence is allowed to speak. The planner, God bless her survival, shifted the evening into tenderness. We are, she said through a small fierce smile, going to do this the way our ancestors did, with fire and nerve. She asked the ensemble to play instruments that forgive shadows. She asked the officiant to speak with the stomach. She asked the family to be guests in their own home for once. When the rehearsal resumed, it looked like a story people might actually believe. The room, deprived of its chandelier's opinion, became gentler. Faces learned one another again. The grandmother's brooch looked like something a person once bought for a person they actually loved. The cousin put down her glass long enough to hear a cello that refused to be background. Victor, forced to pick between control and grace, chose his daughter's silhouette as she passed through the candlelight and, for one truly human second, forgot his portfolio. Elena, without a voltage to organize, sat very still and remembered how to watch the people she had made. In a shaft of hallway near the pantry door, Amelia and my son stood in a light that is older than anything their families could patent. She felt the warmth on her face and realized that the room looks different when the bulbs stop telling it what to be. He took her hand without apologizing to the furniture. They promised nothing. They promised to begin again. After, in the kitchen, the quiet woman leaned on a counter and let herself be tired in public. I handed her water the way drivers hand tools, without ceremony. The generator coughed awake to applause it did not need. The house congratulated itself on resilience that belonged to other people. Victor slapped back. Victor slapped backs. Elena kissed cheeks. The cousin filmed the candlelight and pretended she had orchestrated survival. The planner gathered her clipboard the way a captain gathers names after a wave. The power returned, and with it the performance. But something in the walls had hurt us. The house would not forget. Escalation does not ask for an exit sign. It makes its own. 2 days later, a small careless truth slipped and revealed its underclothes. A florist sent her invoice to the wrong email. It arrived in my inbox, addressed to a holding company that shares the same postal box as a trust that owns the gravel that remembers the shape of their street. Per Ms. S. S. request, the line read, "We have adjusted delivery times to accommodate press." Ms. S is a version of my name that only appears when paperwork talks to money. I stared at it. I did not forward it. I printed it and placed it under the paperweight shaped like a truck. I do not believe in accidents that teach people. I believe in people who learn because they have run out of doors that lead back to the old room. The wrong email began a new hallway. In their house, pressure turned inward. The grandmother rehearsed her toast until it broke. On the 5th try, she cried, which is the body's way of writing a revision. Elena redecorated a second room inside her sleeves. Victor called the planner to demand assurances a weather map can't sell. The cousin purchased more light. Staff worked harder, which is the only thing that ever holds any of it together. My son stopped calling to apologize. He began calling to decide. Amelia stopped asking for permission. She began inviting consequence. They cooked from the cookbook every other night. The stew made their rental smell like a long marriage. Bread warmed under a towel that had known tears and hands. They ate at a table too small for guests and exactly right for them. They did not take a photograph. That is how I know it happened. On a Wednesday that had forgotten its purpose, a storm big enough to earn a name grazed the city. The road bent then held. The venue's power stayed. The house's power stayed. The river, generous, chose not to visit the neighborhood. People in suits congratulated each other on the foresight of their generators. People in boots congratulated the sky on its mercy. I visited the warehouse at midnight to sign a delivery that had outlived its ETA. In the office alone, I found an old Polaroid stuck to the back of a drawer. Robert at a picnic, flower on his cheek, my handwriting at the bottom. If we can laugh on a Thursday, we can outlive anything. I slid it into my pocket like a spell. The next day, the magazine proofs arrived at the house in an envelope that breathes money. Elena spread them on the table like a supper for Image. The photographs were indeed beautiful. They stole breath from anyone who had planned to keep it. The staircase gleamed. The shawl performed its lavender civility on the arm of a chair. The lemons looked devout. Amelia's eyes belonged to the future. My son's jaw belonged to the present. My face belonged to the kind of story editors like to caption with the word grounded. There was a paragraph that mentioned lineage and a paragraph that mentioned work. There was a caption that called me self-made, a phrase that congratulates a person for surviving the mistakes of a century, and then bills her for the ink. There was a sentence about a modest upbringing that wanted to pet me. There was a line about the bread that, despite itself, told the truth. Elena smiled at the way the narrative had arranged itself. Victor asked whether the circulation would reach the right donors. The grandmother found a typo and said nothing. The cousin asked for a PDF to post within minutes of release. Amelia read quietly, her finger tracing a comma that had learned obedience. She looked at my son, he looked at her. They were beginning to understand that a public story is a ceiling unless you cut a skylight. Escalation had one more errand, a rehearsal dinner that would prefer to be a verdict. It was held at a club where lamps know surnames. The menu performed economy and then charged like a museum. The wine list wore a French accent. Staff moved with the accuracy of people who have learned that accidents lead to meetings. Guests arrived in the order their cars told them to. People hugged as if endorsement. People sat where their relationships could be surveilled. There were speeches. The grandmother's toast, repaired by tears, turned into something like mercy. She remembered a girl who had wanted to ride the wrong horse and a mother who had let her. Elena's speech attempted to be love and landed on legacy. Victor's speech attempted to be humble and landed on portfolio. The cousin's speech attempted to be modern and landed on trend. My son's speech attempted to be brave and landed on truth. He thanked the people who do not own chairs but keep chairs useful. He thanked the planner and the chef and the woman who had learned to carry coffee through design hazards without making noise. He thanked his mother for teaching him to measure days by what they hold up, not what they display. Silence followed because the room was not trained for that kind of vocabulary. Then applause, scattered at first, gathered by the people who understand scaffolding. I clapped like the old world does, with both hands and a heart. After, near the coat room where richer coats whisper their insecurities to the ones that still smell like rain, Elena found me. She held herself with that exquisite poise women pay dearly to earn. She said almost gently as if we were kin by choice, "I would never have guessed you were so involved." "In what?" I asked. "In the world." We stood there in the half-light between portraits and hangers, and I saw the child she was once, a girl scolded for wrinkling a dress she loved. I saw the woman she became, a mother trying to manage weather with napkins. I saw the fear that decorates itself and then refuses to be called by its name. "You and I said, both want them safe." "Yes," she said, swallowing the word as if it were larger than she expected. "Then let them choose which kind of safety they mean." She shivered though the room was warm. "You changed the kitchen," she said, and meant the house. "You changed the road," she said, and meant the story. "Who are you?" she wanted to ask. She didn't. Pride is a door with a faulty hinge. I put on my coat. The brown cloth creaked like memory taking a step. "I am the weather that respects work," I said inwardly, not aloud. Aloud I said, "I am his mother." On the sidewalk, the city had the decency to be imperfect. A taxi took the long way. A siren forgot its cue. A man on a bike delivered noodles and hope with equal speed. The moon tried on shapes until it found one that fit the night. Escalation had done its job. It had cracked something elegantly and let the air in. The in-laws' house knew now that light can come from places no chandelier understands. My son knew that love must be practiced where the kitchen is. Amelia knew that language can lie and bread cannot. The staff knew that someone with a brown coat and a patient voice had seen them and not asked them to perform gratitude. The road knew our names in its own way, by the weight we placed on it and how we distributed that weight for other people to survive. And in a drawer, beneath a paperweight shaped like a truck, an invoice and a misaddressed email sat side by side like two shy witnesses waiting to be sworn. Not because revenge wanted its share. Because truth needed a table, and tables need papers with lines on them when stories are ready to be believed by people who only trust what they can file. What remained was not spectacle. It was the open door to a room that had been keeping its breath. The next part would not be louder. It would be sharper. It would not be cruel. It would be accurate. The turning point already walking toward us. Quiet footfalls in a house that thought it had chosen the music. When it arrived, it would not knock. It would sit down where truth had been waiting since the first dinner, and the chairs would remember who paid for them. The day began the way storms begin, quietly, as if silence had something to prove. A low gray sky pressed against the city, flattening its color and its confidence. The world moved slower that morning, not from fatigue but from anticipation, the way air behaves before lightning decides its time. It was the week of the wedding. Every detail had been measured, rehearsed, manicured, but something beneath it all had stopped pretending. The family's house, once a temple of control, now hummed with the sound of people trying too hard to keep their narratives intact. You could feel it in the walls, perfection straining at the seams, truth pacing behind the curtain. That morning I walked the perimeter of my warehouse, my cathedral of quiet engines and steady men. Every echo, every hum, every note of machinery was a hymn that belonged to me, even if my name was never sung. Carol handed me a clipboard. "Everything set for the deliveries?" I asked. She smiled. "Even the one that isn't supposed to exist." She was referring to the private delivery I had arranged days earlier, a discreet truck carrying something not listed on any manifest. A gift and a test. It would arrive at the wedding venue not under my name, but through the company that handled their decor. A single long wooden table. Old oak, aged with scars, sanded but never bleached. It had fed workers and families for decades before finding its way to me. Now it was going to feed truth. By noon, the city had become a field of umbrellas. I rode the bus as always because I like to see how people hold their days. Mothers balancing groceries and children. Old men reading newspapers that still believed in ink. Strangers lending a hand not for the photo, but for the piece. That's the difference between my world and theirs. Ours runs on grace, not optics. The bus hissed at my stop. I stepped down and watched the storm begin its soft rehearsal. At the same hour, across the city, Elena was inspecting the floral arrangements with the precision of a surgeon. "No lavender in the main hall," she instructed. "It clashes with the theme." The florist nodded, eyes down, rearranging petals for peace. In her reflection in the mirror, Elena looked perfect, except for her eyes. They were calculating a problem she couldn't name. Victor was in the study on a call with investors who never sleep. He used the word liquid more times than love deserves. Amelia was upstairs, sitting by the window, tracing the condensation with her finger. Her phone glowed with a text she had written but never sent. "Mom, please stop." She deleted it. Again. Evan was at the construction site that morning, his project, not his father-in-law's, reviewing plans, steadying his mind with work. Every beam, every line on paper, gave him something the house never could, purpose that doesn't need witnesses. By the time I reached the venue, the storm had turned into a drizzle fine enough to be mistaken for air. The long table had already been delivered. It sat in the center of the reception hall like a confession carved into wood. Staff were wiping it down, unsure who had sent it but too respectful to question its arrival. The planner saw me and frowned. "You're early, Miss Sanders." "I like to watch things take shape," I said. She nodded, adjusting her headset. "It's all coming together. The press will be here soon." Press. The word always makes rooms forget their real weight. Elena arrived moments later, a silhouette in cream and expectation. "What's that doing here?" she demanded, pointing to the table. "It was part of the order," the planner said quickly. "Special request from the groom's family." "The groom's?" Elena turned. "Did you send this?" I looked at the table. It looked like it belonged here. Her smile was paper-thin. "We have rented imported tables for the dinner. This," she gestured with her manicured hand, "looks like it belongs in a farmhouse." I smiled softly. "Then it belongs somewhere honest." The silence that followed was the sound of an empire frowning. That night, during the rehearsal dinner, the table sat in the middle of the hall like an uninvited truth that refused to leave. Every other piece of decor, crystal, silver, velvet, looked nervous beside it. Guests arrived, complimenting what they didn't understand, sipping their approval from glasses they didn't pay for. Elena's friends whispered as they passed it. Rustic, one said. Sentimental, said another. But when they sat down, their voices lowered, their bodies softened. There was something about the wood, about its grain still holding the fingerprints of other lives, that refused to let them posture. Amelia ran her fingers across its surface and whispered, "It feels alive." I sat at the far end, quiet, watching the room shift like a tide. I had seen it before, how truth rearranges the air before it speaks. Dinner began. Laughter practiced. Glasses clinked. Victor made a toast about legacy, Elena about unity, the grandmother about blessings disguised as wealth. Then my son stood. His voice, steady but trembling at the edges, filled the room. "I want to thank everyone," he began, "but especially the people who taught me what wealth really means." He looked at me. "When I was young," he said, "my mother worked nights. She used to come home with hands so tired she could barely lift her tea. But she always said the same thing: if your work builds peace for someone else, then it's not wasted." He paused, breathing the silence into himself. "Tonight, I just want everyone to know, the only legacy I want is to live up to that kind of wealth." The applause, unsure of its cue. Some clapped out of politeness, others because their hearts betrayed them. Elena's hands moved, but her face didn't. Victor's jaw tightened. Amelia, tearful, squeezed my hand under the table. I whispered to her, "Your father-in-law's family builds walls. Your husband builds rooms. Know the difference?" She nodded. After dinner, Elena cornered me near the hallway lined with portraits of people who thought ownership could outlive kindness. "You're making a spectacle of yourself," she hissed. "No," I said. "I'm making space." "For what?" "For the truth. It needs somewhere to sit." She took a step closer. "You've been meddling from the start. The road, the catering, even the stories in that magazine. Do you think I don't know who you are?" I smiled. "You know what I let you know." Her breath faltered. "Who are you?" "Someone who remembers what you forgot," I said. "That none of this," I gestured around us, "is yours to keep. Not the money, not the praise, not even the children. The only thing that's truly ours is how we treat the ones with less." Her eyes glistened, not with tears but with fear. "You planned all this." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "No, Elena. Life did. I just stopped getting in its way." The night ended like a curtain lowering, slow, reluctant, heavy. When I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The streets smelled of wet earth and beginnings. Across the road, the workers from my company were finishing their shifts at the venue, unloading, stacking, sweeping. None of them knew that the woman watching from under the awning signed their paychecks. That was the point. One of them, a young woman with tired eyes and a bright laugh, waved at me. "Night, ma'am," she called. "Good night," I said. "Get home safe." Behind me, through the tall windows, I could see Elena standing alone, looking at the table. She didn't touch it, flawed, unpolished, but real. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and Robert's photograph. I told him what happened like I always do. "She asked who I am," I whispered. "And for the first time, I think she's ready to know." Outside, thunder rolled like a slow exhale. Somewhere in that grand house, a woman in pearls couldn't sleep because the truth was sitting at her table, and it wasn't planning to leave. The morning after the rehearsal dinner arrived without music. The city felt muted, as though even the pigeons were waiting for permission to begin again. The storm had washed everything clean, but it hadn't dried what it unearthed. That's the strange mercy of rain. It doesn't destroy appearances. It reveals what appearances tried to hide. I sat by the window with my first cup of tea, the kind of cup that forgives yesterday's arguments. The air smelled faintly of oak and wet asphalt, and my reflection in the glass looked like my mother's, older, calmer, less afraid to let the world be wrong about her. The brown coat hung by the door, drying like a soldier's flag after a quiet victory. I wasn't thinking about revenge, not even justice. I was thinking about rest, about how truth once spoken doesn't need to be repeated, it just needs to be allowed to settle. But truth has its own schedule. It's not always polite about when it decides to arrive. By 10, my phone began to tremble across the kitchen table. Calls. Texts. Then a headline notification that took my breath in the most unexpected way. Local businesswoman behind quiet philanthropy identified, the hidden benefactor who funded the city's road repairs and job programs. It wasn't a gossip piece. It wasn't a scandal. It was an exposure dressed as gratitude. Someone, maybe a clerk, maybe a journalist tracing invoices, had followed a trail of company names and charitable fund numbers until they found the same signature written in ink I hadn't changed in 20 years mine. They hadn't printed my name cruelly. They'd printed it curiously. But curiosity is still a spotlight. I closed my eyes and behind my lids I saw faces. The workers, the foreman, Carol, my son. The story wasn't wrong, but it wasn't ready either. The city would learn who I was before the people who had spent months pretending I wasn't worth listening to. And that, I suppose, is what made it poetic. At the Sanders mansion, breakfast turned into an emergency. Victor was pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low but sharp. She hid this, he said to whoever was listening on the other end. She built all this and said nothing. Do you understand what this means for us? Elena stood at the window, holding her teacup like a fragile argument. For us, she repeated softly. Or for her. The grandmother, half deaf but twice perceptive, looked up from her seat. I told you, she said simply. The humble ones are the dangerous ones. Amelia came down the stairs in her robe, hair unbrushed, eyes wide with disbelief. It's her, she said. The article, it's all her. Her voice trembled somewhere between awe and fear. She owns the company that did the roads, the warehouses, even the distribution for the relief funds last winter. Victor turned. She manipulated us. This was all some test. Elena shook her head. No, she said, almost whispering. I think it was a mirror. Meanwhile, at my warehouse, the phone wouldn't stop ringing either, but those calls sounded different. Old partners. New reporters. People who suddenly remembered favors. But among them were quieter voices. A driver calling just to say, we always knew you were somebody. A teacher from the literacy program saying, now we can tell people who believed in us. A city worker saying, thank you for the road and for not needing the credit. I answered none of the journalists. I answered the teacher. I answered the driver. I answered the worker. And when Carol walked in waving her phone like a guilty child, I smiled before she said a word. It was bound to come out, she said, setting down her coffee. Do. Eventually. She studied my face. You're calm. Would it change anything if I weren't? She laughed quietly. You're a better person than I am. No, I said. Just one who's been misunderstood longer. By noon the calls slowed. The city's attention span began its familiar migration. But the house on Birchfield Avenue, the one with the chandelier, didn't know how to move on. Stayed lit like a courtroom. Amelia was the first to break through the noise. She drove to my warehouse that afternoon. No chauffeur, no announcement. Just rain streaks on her windshield and confusion on her face. When she walked in, the workers recognized her from the rehearsal photos, but no one stared too long. My people don't stare. They observe then return to work. That's how respect behaves in my world. She found me by the loading dock, clipboard in hand, reviewing manifests like nothing had changed. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, voice barely louder than the rain on the roof. Because who I am doesn't change who you married, I said. Yes, it does, she said, her voice cracking. They're all at the house losing their minds. Victor says you played us. My mother, she's quiet. That's worse. I smiled sadly. She's realizing something. That power borrowed from money is louder than power earned from character. One survives the night. The other survives history. Amelia stared at the ground, then back up at me. You planned all of this, didn't you? I shook my head. No, I planted it. Life did the rest. That evening the house summoned me. The call came from Victor himself, short-clipped, urgent. I think it's time we talk. Shoes that never lied. The same house but different air. Even the chandeliers seemed to blink slower. They were all waiting in the living room. The family, the planner, the cousin pretending to be busy, the grandmother pretending to be asleep but listening. The article lay open on the coffee table, the headline gleaming like judgment. Victor began. You could have told us. I could have, I said. But you would have heard it differently. Elena's voice was quieter. You watched us treat you like. She stopped, searching for the right cruelty. Like someone beneath us. I didn't flinch. And yet here I am, still sitting with you. Which one of us needs to apologize? Her lip trembled and she looked away. You made us look small, she whispered. No, I said. I reminded you that you already were. There's a difference. Victor leaned forward. You embarrassed this family. No, Victor. You embarrassed yourselves. I just didn't cover for you. The room was still. The grandmother opened her eyes. Well, she said softly, it's about time someone said it. Silence followed, thick, necessary. Then Amelia spoke, her voice firm and trembling all at once. She's right. All of this, every insult, every whisper, it wasn't about her. It was about us. About how we treat people we think we don't need. She turned to her father. You taught me to read contracts. She taught me to read people. Only one of those skills has ever kept me safe. Victor's face softened, not with acceptance but with exhaustion. Elena was crying now, not loudly but cleanly. You came here with so much grace, she said to me. And we gave you none. I stood. That's not true. You gave me something better, a place to put my truth. I looked at Amelia, then at my son. And now they'll build something stronger because they've seen what you were too afraid to look at. That, I didn't need them. As I walked down the gravel path, the rain started again, not angry, just persistent. The house glowed behind me, smaller somehow, like wealth does when it's been humbled. My son caught up to me halfway to the gate. Mom, he said. You didn't have to do any of this. I smiled. Maybe not. But sometimes love isn't what you do to protect someone. It's what you let them see about the world. He took my hand. I'm proud of you, I laughed. You're supposed to say that to your children, not your mother. He grinned. Then I guess we're even. We stood there in the drizzle. No longer the poor mother and her rich in-laws. No longer the test or the disguise. Just two people who had finally met in the same light. Inside the mansion, Elena walked into the dining room alone. The oak table stood there, candlelight crawling across its grain like forgiveness. She ran her hand across it. It was warm. She sat down, her reflection trembling in the glass of her untouched wine. The truth had not destroyed her. It had simply asked her to stop pretending. And for the first time she did. That night, as I returned home, I opened Robert's photograph again. I think, I whispered, you'd like how it ended. She saw herself finally. And our boy, he's free now. I set the picture back on the table beside the tea, where light and shadow met perfectly. The rain kept tapping at the window, but this time it sounded like applause. Mornings after revelation don't look different at first. The sun rises at the same speed. The kettle still sings the same key. But something inside the air changes, like the world has been exhaling through clenched teeth for years and finally remembers how to breathe. It had been 3 days since the truth began to circulate like weather. 3 days since the paper turned my anonymity into currency. 3 days since the in-laws' mansion stopped performing happiness and started living in the discomfort of reflection. And it was my son came by every evening. Not to apologize, not to explain, but simply to sit. He would bring tea, sometimes the wrong kind, and we'd talk about things that weren't about money or legacy. We'd talk about his designs, about roofs that don't just cover people but collect rain, about buildings that hold heat like memories instead of like prisons. He talked like a man building something for more than investors. He talked like Robert used to. Elena called me the next morning. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, as if she had borrowed humility and wasn't sure how to return it. I wanted to apologize, she said. For what? For all of it. For assuming what kind of woman you were. I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. You didn't assume wrong. You just didn't assume enough. There was a pause. A breath that trembled. You'll come to the wedding, won't you? She asked. No more surprises? No surprises, I said. Just truth. She laughed quietly, a sound unsure of itself but trying. I think I'd like to know that kind of truth, she whispered. The day of the wedding dawned with weather that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or bless. Clouds drifted like slow applause. The road gleamed steady and smooth. The one my cruise had fixed months before. It looked as though it knew something the rest of the city didn't, that even beauty needs maintenance. The venue buzzed with last-minute preparations. Caterers arranged the tables, the same oak one still commanding the center like an altar built for honesty. The florist hummed softly as she replaced imported flowers with wild blooms she'd gathered from local fields, the kind that didn't look rehearsed. And in the corner, the planner, once frantic, looked calm for the first time. Perhaps because chaos, when it finally serves truth, becomes purpose. I arrived early again. Elena was already there, standing by the oak table. Her pearls were gone. Her dress, simple linen instead of silk. When she saw me, her face softened. Not the practiced smile she used to wear for social armor, but something quieter. Something human. "Do you know," she said, "I used to think money protected us from humiliation. But I think what it really did was hide our need for grace." I nodded. Grace doesn't like to be bought. It likes to be practiced. She smiled faintly. "You're still teaching." "No," I said. "You're finally listening." Amelia entered then, radiant, not from wealth but from peace. Her gown was simple, a thread of ivory and patience. Her hair was pinned loosely, a few curls disobedient enough to prove she was real. She hugged me before anyone else. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything you didn't say." Evan followed, his tie crooked, his heart visible in his eyes. He kissed my cheek. "You were right," he murmured. "Truth doesn't ruin people. It just gives them the chance to rebuild with real materials." I touched his sleeve. "Just make sure your marriage is built like that, on work that lasts longer than pride." The ceremony began. Guests filled the seats, whispering about the article, the story, the fortune that had apparently been hiding in plain sight. But something strange happened. No one cared for long. Because the room, lit by real sunlight instead of chandeliers, had learned how to be honest. The officiant spoke of love as labor, of commitment as maintenance. He quoted something Robert once said to me. "Love is not two people holding hands. It's two people holding the same line through the storm." When the vows came, Evan's voice shook, but he didn't break. Amelia's tears landed on his hand, and for once no one wiped them away. They were allowed to stay, to shine, to mean something. As they exchanged rings, the rain started outside, tapping lightly on the roof, and someone laughed quietly, because even heaven couldn't resist joining in. At the reception, the staff moved with ease, guests clapped without calculation, and even Victor smiled without rehearsing at first. The oak table, old, solid, unashamed, held bread, wine, and stories. When the music started, Elena approached me again. "I was wrong about you," she said softly. I looked at her. "You weren't wrong. You just hadn't met me yet." Her eyes glistened. "I didn't think people like you existed." "They do," I said. "You just don't usually invite them to dinner." We both laughed, and for the first time it wasn't awkward, it was free. As the evening settled into comfort, the kitchen door opened and the staff emerged with plates of stew and fresh bread, the same recipe from my old cookbook. I saw Amelia had planned it. "Tonight," she said in her toast, "we serve the meal that began this story, a reminder that love tastes best when it's shared with humility." Applause rose, but this time it didn't sound like noise. It sounded like gratitude. Later, when the music softened and the candles burned low, I stepped outside. The night air was cool and forgiving. The road glimmered beneath the streetlights, the same one my company had built and repaired, now carrying laughter, not judgment. I turned when I heard footsteps behind me. It was Victor. No arrogance, no mask. Just a man who looked like someone meeting himself for the first time. He cleared his throat. "I read the article again," he said. "Twice. It made me feel small." I smiled. "Then it worked." He nodded slowly, then held out his hand. "I'd like to help fund those literacy programs. Quietly, if you'd let me." I shook his hand. "Quietly is the only way that matters." He exhaled. "You're a remarkable woman." "No," I said, looking back at the glowing windows. "I'm just one who refused to stay invisible." When I left that night, I walked home instead of taking the bus. The air was thick with music, laughter, and stopped, but puddles still reflected the lights. Small mirrors, shimmering, imperfect, beautiful. I thought of Robert again, of the promises we kept, the storms we survived, and the son who had become a man without losing his tenderness. Some stories end with triumph. Ours ended with quiet. And quiet, when it belongs to peace, is louder than applause. Inside that grand house, long after the last guest left, Elena walked back to the oak table. She placed her hand on it and whispered a single word into the grain. "Thank you. It wasn't meant for me. It was meant for truth." Because truth had finally stayed. When a storm passes, people look at what it broke. But the wise look at what it revealed. In the weeks that followed the wedding, the city began to speak about us in stories that didn't belong to gossip anymore. They belonged to reflection. The article that had once felt like exposure now read like testimony. And the people who had mocked the poor mother at the first dinner were slowly learning what it meant to be truly seen. The first change began, not in marble rooms or board meetings, but in kitchens. At my warehouse, the men and women who worked the early shift found a new sign posted on the bulletin board. Scholarships for employees' families, funded by the Sanders Foundation. No press, no gala, no photographers. Just opportunity. Quiet, deliberate, honest. I didn't announce it. I didn't have to. Carol told them. She always told stories better than I did. She said, she wanted to teach us that dignity doesn't need a stage. It just needs a start. Across town in Elena's house, another kind of transformation was underway. The mansion that once measured wealth by chandeliers now kept its light softer. The pearls stayed in their boxes. The laughter became unpracticed. And for the first time, the help sat at the same table for meals. Elena began volunteering at the literacy center I'd funded years before. At first, she went to supervise. An instinct she didn't yet know how to silence. But within weeks, she was showing up early, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, reading with women whose names she couldn't pronounce but whose hunger she recognized. Grace doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps through the cracks pride leaves behind. The first time I saw her there, she was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside a little girl from a migrant family, sounding out words one syllable at a time. The child giggled when Elena mispronounced penguin, and Elena giggled back. It was the sound of a woman rebuilding her own language. When she looked up and saw me in the doorway, she didn't stiffen like she used to. She just smiled, tired but real. "I'm terrible at this," she said. "No," I replied. "You're learning again." She nodded. Maybe that's what grace really is. Getting a second childhood. Victor's redemption was quieter. He wasn't built for humility. It fit him like a new suit, stiff at first but wearable. He started making calls, but not the kind he used to. He reached out to the same contractors he once ignored, asking how to improve safety, how to make work more humane. He found that listening didn't cost anything and yet felt like paying a debt. A month later, he asked me to meet him for coffee. When I arrived, he was already seated, no assistance, no performance. He looked older, not in years but in awareness. "I used to think leadership was about making people smaller," he said. "It's about making space," I told him. He nodded slowly. "You've been making space for people your whole life, haven't you? I just didn't know it would take this long for people to notice." He laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that doesn't need to win. Before we parted, he said, "If you ever need an investor." "I don't," I interrupted gently. "But thank you for finally offering." He understood that the thank you wasn't for his money, it was for his growth. Amelia and Evan built their marriage the way craftsmen build slowly, intentionally, with the kind of patience that refuses shortcuts. They bought a small house near the edge of the city. Not a mansion. Not even a statement. Just a home with space for a garden, a workbench, and a long table. Their own oak table, gifted from me. They kept it imperfect on purpose. A reminder that love doesn't need polish to last. Sometimes I would visit and find them barefoot on the kitchen floor, cooking together, music low, bread rising in the oven. And I would stand quietly in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt what peace sounds like when it finally learns its name. Months passed. The city changed in small ways that only those who live close to the ground notice. Roads were repaired before they broke. Contracts were renegotiated to pay fairly. A library opened in the old industrial district, its sign painted by hand. And on its opening day, I watched Elena cut the ribbon while the same workers she once ignored cheered her on. She found me afterward, hands trembling slightly, and said, "I never knew doing good could feel this normal." "It's supposed to," I said. "That's why it's good." She squeezed my hand. "You made me look at myself, you know." I smiled. "I just cleaned your mirror." That night as I walked home, the air was cold but forgiving. The streetlights hummed. The city pulsed like a sleeping animal. In every reflection from every window I saw echoes of the journey, the naive mother, the mocking laughter, the table that waited for truth, the storm that turned into mercy. And I realized something I hadn't before. Redemption doesn't happen when people are punished. It happens when they finally see themselves without defense and choose to rebuild. A week later, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph of that oak table, this time covered not with silverware, but with books, notebooks, and pencils. In the corner of the picture, I recognized the little girl from the literacy center, now smiling in front of a word she'd written herself, home. On the back, Elena had written, "Thank you for reminding me where it begins." I set the picture down and looked at the empty chair across from me, the one Robert used to fill. "Looks like the storm did what it came to do," I whispered. Outside, the wind carried the scent of bread from the corner bakery. The city, my city, felt like a heart finally learning how to beat without armor. There are kinds of forgiveness the world never writes about. The kind that happens in grocery aisles, between two strangers who stop pretending they're different. The kind that lives in laughter around repaired tables. The kind that lingers in eyes that used to compete and now simply understand. That's the forgiveness I saw now, moving through the streets like a quiet revival. The proud had learned to kneel. The wounded had learned to rise. And the forgotten had found their names again. The truth, once feared, now lived openly in the city's breath. And somewhere between the sound of trucks backing into docks and children learning to read, I understood. This story wasn't about wealth at all. It was about inheritance. And the only thing worth inheriting is grace. The last act of any story isn't the end. It's the echo. It's what stays behind when the applause has faded, when the lessons have folded themselves into quiet gestures, when the truth no longer feels like revelation but like air, necessary, invisible, sustaining. Months turned into seasons. The city softened in ways only the patient notice. The air no longer trembled with ambition, it hummed with contentment. Everywhere I looked, life was slower but fuller, as if people had finally remembered that value wasn't measured in velocity but in kindness. The oak table that once witnessed judgment had now become a city-wide legend. It wasn't famous because it was beautiful. It was famous because it stayed. It sat at the literacy center now, in a room lined with mismatched chairs and shelves filled with donated books. The same workers who had once bowed their heads at elite galas now sat around it during lunch breaks, reading to their children, learning new words, tasting self-worth. One morning I visited quietly. No cameras, no ceremony. Just me, my coat, and my breath fogging against the cold glass door. Inside, Elena was leading a reading session. Her pearls replaced by laughter, her voice softer, warmer. A boy stumbled through a sentence, and she beamed as if he'd solved an equation only God could write. When she saw me, she waved, smiling the way people smile when they've forgiven themselves. And I knew in that moment that the table had finished its work. At home, my life had become beautifully ordinary. The warehouse ran without me most days. Carol had taken over, efficient and kind, making sure no one ever forgot why we started, and why we stayed small enough to remember names. I spent my mornings tending the small garden behind my house. Tomatoes, thyme, lavender. Robert used to joke that lavender was heaven's apology for loneliness. When the wind moved through it, I could still hear his voice, still feel his steadiness beneath the noise of time. Sometimes my son and Amelia would visit. They'd bring their little one, my granddaughter, who had just learned to walk, and who loved to explore the world with the entitlement of innocence. She'd toddle between us, laughing, carrying crumbs from the kitchen to the garden, her hands sticky with the sweetness of what we'd all been starving for, peace. I'd catch her reflection in the window, chasing sunlight, and think, maybe that's what forgiveness looks like when it's born, unafraid to touch everything it sees. Evan had built something beautiful. A small architectural firm that specialized in rebuilding old neighborhoods instead of erasing them. He said once, "Mom, people think the future means new. But the future is repair." He designed parks where abandoned lots used to be. He restored buildings, left the cracks visible, filled them with stories instead of shame. He said the cracks reminded people that healing doesn't mean pretending. When the city unveiled one of his projects, a repurposed shipping warehouse turned into a community hall, he named it Robert's Place. Inside, on the wall near the entrance, A small brass plaque read, "For those who worked without applause. For those who built without being seen." I stood there the day it opened, watching people walk in and out, never realizing the woman behind them was the reason the lights stayed on. And for once I didn't need them to know. That was the gift of time. It teaches you that peace doesn't need an audience. Elena and Victor came too that day. No announcement, no performance. Victor looked older but lighter, the way people look when they've stopped defending themselves. He shook my hand, and in his grip I felt no pride, only gratitude. He said, "You know, I used to think legacy meant control. But it's actually the opposite, isn't it? It's release." I smiled. Control is heavy. Release is wealth. Elena hugged me, surprising us both. "We're hosting Sunday dinners," she said. "You'll come?" I nodded. "Only if you let me bring the bread." She laughed. "Deal." And just like that, the walls that had once separated us, class, fear, ego, began to crumble into something softer. Friendship. Years passed. The city grew around the truths we had built. Children who once feared smallness now bragged about simplicity. Charity lost its performative glow and found humility again. People started saying thank you not as punctuation but as prayer. And through it all I stayed the same. Just a woman in a brown coat, walking streets that no longer flinched at rain, smiling at faces that finally looked each other in the eye. On a quiet afternoon near winter, I visited the table one last time. The literacy center was closed for the holidays. Dust danced in the sunlight slanting through the blinds, and in that light, each grain of wood, faint scratches, stains, fingerprints, all of them testimonies. I ran my hand across it, slow and reverent. It was warm, as if truth itself had learned to keep its own temperature. For a moment I imagined all of us gathered again. Evan laughing, Amelia serving bread, Elena talking too much, Victor listening for once, the workers smiling, my granddaughter chasing crumbs across the floor, and Robert standing quietly behind me, his hand on my shoulder. I whispered, "We did it, love. We turned shame into shelter." The air didn't answer. Didn't need to. It shimmered softly the way only gratitude does. That night I sat by the window watching the city glow below me. Streetlights blinked like old souls winking. Somewhere a child read her first sentence out loud. Somewhere else, someone offered a stranger a ride home without expecting thanks. And somewhere, maybe everywhere, people who once believed humility was weakness were beginning to see it for what it really is. The strongest inheritance of all. I closed my eyes and listened to the city breathe. It didn't sound like wealth. It sounded like redemption. They once laughed when I walked in, a mother in worn shoes and borrowed hope. But I've learned that laughter fades faster than truth. Years later, when they sit at their tables breaking bread and passing kindness, they won't remember my clothes. They'll remember what I taught them. That the richest people are the ones who can walk into any room, bring grace with them, and leave everyone else richer.